We're on Gimel Amud Aleph, 3a, in the middle. The Gemara introduces now a kind of new statement and then going to analyze it. Now, the context of the statement comes here because we discussed earlier this idea of the spirit of jealousy that enters the husband's mind that makes him warn his wife against secluding herself with somebody else. And that begins the whole process of the Sotah. And we had some comments earlier about this, about it being past tense. Before that, we talked about this spirit, the Torah uses the word spirit of jealousy. Earlier, we talked about the spirit of foolishness that enters the mind for sin. So we're still within that context that the Gemara makes the following statement. And it's right over here. If you can see my cursor where it's blue right there. Okay. Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel. It's been taught in the study house of Rabbi Shmuel. Ein adam mekana le'ishtay. A person would never warn his wife. Elam kain, only if nichnasa bai, there entered in him ruach, a spirit. So it's some divine messaging. That's the way Rashi puts it. Yeah, there's some divine messaging coming from on high. Rashi said mimara, and from on high, that's making him or compelling him to feel the urge to warn his wife. Now, the Gemara does not say, or Rabbi Shmuel does not say here, whether this spirit is a spirit that's good or negative, right? It's coming from on high. It's coming from some spiritual place, but is it coming from positive spiritual forces or from negative spiritual forces? That the Gemara is going to discuss momentarily. But first says the Gemara, Shenemar, as the verse reads, and there comes into him a spirit of jealousy. And then he warns his wife. Again, it's introduced with this word ruach, this word spirit. So it must be then that there's some sort of spiritual energy that's entering into him that's causing him to feel jealous and urging him to warn his wife. Okay, so this is the end of the statement of Rabbi Shmuel. Excuse me. So the Gemara now asks, my ruach, what kind of spirit is it? Is it a positive spiritual spirit or is it a negative spiritual spirit? So we have a dispute. Rabbanan, the majority of sages, said ruach tuma. This is talking about a spirit of impurity that's causing him to feel jealous and warn his wife. Because under good circumstances, he wouldn't do that. Rav Ashi Amar, right? Because there's no reason to get into this whole business of causing his wife distress and then sending her to be part of the Sotah and getting her humiliated, embarrassed in the temple. This whole thing, it must be an impure spirit that's causing him to set this whole thing in motion. Now, Rav Ashi argues, Amar, and says, Ruach Tahara, it's a spirit of purity. It's a positive spiritual energy. Because now what's happening, his jealousy or his warning stems not from a negative emotion, but actually from his desire to maintain purity, to maintain, to prevent pritzis, to prevent, that's what Rashi says, prevent promiscuity. He's trying to stop promiscuity here. So there's a good thing happening here, right? And therefore the Gemara is going to relate this back to an earlier discussion we had. Is warning one's wife a good thing? Is it a mitzvah a person should do? Or a person shouldn't do it, but if he did, here's the law. Right? And it would come down to this. Do you think that the warning is just a bad negative emotion that's jealousy, and therefore rather don't go down that path? Or like Rav Ashi, it's not a jealousy. It's actually coming from a place of purity. It's coming from a desire to maintain, to uphold modesty and to prevent any promiscuity. So is it a good thing or is it not a good thing? Now the question is what Rabbi Shmuel meant. Right, because this comment is this dispute between the sages and Rav Ashi, whether the spirit that enters the person that causes him to, that urges him to warn his wife, is that a spirit of jealousy and impurity, or is it a spirit of purity and desire to maintain modesty? So the question is, they were discussing what Rabbi Shmuel meant, because Rabbi Shmuel is the one that said, right, Talmud Sotah Rabbi Shmuel was taught in the house of Rabbi Shmuel, that a person only warns his wife if a spirit enters him. And Rabbanan are saying, the sages are saying it's a spirit of negativity, What Rav Ashi is saying is a spirit of positivity. So the question now is, what did Rabbi Shmuel mean? So says the Gemara Mistabra, it would seem to make sense, command Amar, to follow the view of the one who says, which is Rav Ashi, Ruach Tahara, that this is a spirit of purity. That the urge that he feels to warn his wife comes from a positive place, where he desires to promote modesty and prevent promiscuity. So why would we think that this is Rabbi Shmuel's view? The Tanya, for we've learned, Vikines Ishtoi, the verse, the Mishnaic H text is analyzing the verse, which we quoted earlier, that he warns his wife. And here is the root of the dispute, or the source of the dispute, as to whether or not it is something a person should do, he should warn his wife, or is it something that, if he did, then here's the law. And this is the dispute. Rishus, Divri Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael is of the view that when the Torah says that this man warned his wife, it's not that he should warn his wife, it's Rishus, it is voluntary. If he wants to, he may. That's the view of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says, Chayva, it's obligatory. So Rabbi Shmuel says if a person wants to warn his wife, he may, and then the law of the Sotah follows. Rabbi Akiva says it's obligatory. If a person sees his wife behaving promiscuously, then he should warn her so that she hopefully stops. And if she doesn't, then she will have to deal with whatever consequences fall in laws of the Sotah. So Rabbi Shmuel says voluntary. Rabbi Akiva says obligated to warn his wife. End of Mishnaic text. Now, how is this a proof that this is a spirit of purity? So explains the Gemara, indeed it is all well if you suggest that the spirit that is urging him to warn his wife is a spirit of purity, then shapir. It would make sense that they are arguing as to whether it's obligatory or voluntary, because neither of them say it's forbidden. If it was a spirit of impurity, if it was a completely negative experience, then at least one of them would say it's forbidden. From the fact that one says it's voluntary and the other one says it's obligatory, means they both agree it's a good thing. It's just a question of, do you have to? And therefore the Gemara spells it out. But if you were to suggest ruach tuma, if you were to suggest that the spirit that enters him to urge him to warn his wife is a spirit of impurity and it comes from a negative spiritual force, would there be such a discussion of voluntarily or obligatorily to voluntary or even obligatorily bring about upon himself a spirit of impurity? Would that be suggested? If it was indeed a spirit of impurity, then it would seem to reason that they should say that it's forbidden. And the fact that the dispute is whether it's obligatory or voluntary means that it's a spirit of positivity. It's a positive thing that he's warning his wife. And therefore the question only is obligatory or voluntary. Okay. So now the Gemara established that, again, we have to always keep in the back of our minds what we learned at the beginning of the Gemara, where the Gemara said that if a person, that Reish Lakish, when he would begin to teach the law of the Sotah, he would begin by saying that anyone, that a person marries the woman that he deserves, as it were. And the Gemara, and Reish Lakish therefore said that if a person gets to the point where his wife is behaving that way, he should examine his own deeds. We have to keep that in the background. Even as we maintain, as we just did now, that maybe his warning is a good thing, and it's a good thing, and it's either obligatory or it's voluntary, but it's a spirit of purity. It's a spirit of him trying to uphold modesty and prevent promiscuity. So even as that's true, the idea that Reish Lakish said earlier, that a person has to look in the mirror, is also true. And perhaps the way we would put these two together is as follows. If it is indeed, the urge to warn is indeed a positive thing, then the person needs to look in the mirror and dig deep within himself. Am I feeling all that purity? Or is there some of my own motivation that's jealousy and negativity here? And if my experience matches this truth that it's absolutely pure of motive, then maybe I should go ahead with the warning. Even if you're of the view, again, this is not a halachic comment, I should make that clear, because the Gemara is discussing obligations here. And it would seem that the halacha is that it's actually an obligation. But I would still maintain that even if it's an obligation to warn his wife, he still should look in the mirror and examine himself and think of, where is this coming from, right? And I'll give you another example of this. The law is, there's a mitzvah in the Torah that if a person sees somebody else misbehaving, then there's an obligation to rebuke that person. That there's a mitzvah to rebuke or help correct somebody else's behavior. And yet, we are instructed that even as we fulfill this command to correct somebody else's behavior, we have to look into ourselves and ask ourselves, why am I motivated to correct this person's behavior? Is it because I feel a sense of superiority and I look down at that person and I want to save that person from, from destruction, so to speak? But it's truly coming from a place of superiority, and it bothers me that he's misbehaving and therefore I want to correct him. Or is it coming from a place of love? I truly love this person and I truly want this person to get to do well, right? We all experience this. There's people who we see misbehaving and they unnerve us, and then there's our children who misbehave, and the way in which we treat our children that misbehave and the way in which we invest our emotional attachment to try to correct them is very different than the way we would react to somebody else who's unnerving us because they're misbehaving. So all I'm trying to say is that even though there's an obligation to do something, it doesn't mean you don't have to look inward and ask yourself, why am I motivated to do this? Right? Just because it's an obligation doesn't mean it's carte blanche, right? So just like when I'm rebuking or correcting somebody else's behavior, which is an obligation of a Torah, I still have to examine myself and ask myself, what are my motives? So I would submit that the same thing's true over here. Even if it's an obligation to warn one's wife because he wants to uphold modesty, etc., he has to look within himself and ask himself, is it truly true that I'm doing this at a pure motive? Or is there some other negative emotion here? And if there is some negative emotion here, maybe I should do some soul searching before I start pointing fingers at my wife. I'm suggesting, I haven't seen this written anywhere, but it would seem correct to me. Okay. The Gemara goes forward, and the Gemara is now going to introduce other disputes, other areas in Torah law where Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva dispute as to whether or not there's an obligation or voluntary. Right? That was the root of this discussion. Rabbi Akiva said that warning one's wife is obligatory, and Rabbi Shmuel says it's voluntary. And we deduced from this dispute as to whether it's voluntary or obligatory that it must be a positive thing, because if it was negative, at least one of them would say forbidden. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to introduce other cases in which Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva have a similar dispute as to whether or not what the Torah instructs is obligatory or voluntary. So it says the Gemara like this: Gufa, going back to the text we quoted earlier, where there it said, Bikines Ishtoi, we quoted the verse which reads that a person warns his wife, and by warning his wife, he sets the law of the Sotah in motion. Rishus, that is a voluntary experience. A person's not obligated to warn his wife. It's a voluntary action. Div Rabbi Shmuel, and this was the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva said, Chayva, it's obligatory, right? So this is the dispute we quoted earlier. Rabbi Shmuel says it's a person warning his wife is a voluntary action, which Rabbi Akiva says it's obligatory. Now the text includes other laws of similar dispute. La yitama. This is a verse in I think it's Parshas Emor. Yeah, which is where there it discusses the law of, I think it's in Emor, where there it discusses the law of the prohibition of the kohen from becoming defiled, becoming impure by coming in contact with a dead body, and therefore he's not allowed to attend funerals. And there the Torah says the exception, that for his family, for certain immediate family, he is allowed to become impure. Specifically, the verse is talking about his unmarried sister. Right, you can see it on the side over here. And for a sister who is not married and is close to her, who has not been married, he should become impure for her. Okay, so now is this an instruction that a kohen is obligated to go to the funeral of his sister, or is it voluntary that if he wants to, he may become impure and go to this funeral? And this is the same dispute between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Rishos, this opinion says that it's voluntary. Give Rabbi Shmuel. This is the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says that the kohen going to his sister or his family member's funeral and becoming that in that way impure is not an obligation, it's voluntary. But Rabbi Akiva says, it's obligatory, and this is the law. He's actually obliged to become impure and go to his family member's funeral, specific family members. Okay, so here we have a second dispute where Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva argue as to whether there's obligation or voluntary. The first is the law of the Sotah. Does he have to warn his wife? Rabbi Akiva says yes. Rabbi Shmuel says voluntary. Argument number two, case number two is the Kohen attending a family member's funeral and in that way becoming impure. Rabbi Shmuel says that's a voluntary thing. He doesn't have to go to the funeral, but if he wants to, he may. Rabbi Akiva says no, he is obligated to go to his family member's funeral and become impure. Third case where the similar dispute exists. La'olam bahem ta'avodu. This is the law of the Evet Kanani, right? Where's the Rashi? Not here. But this is the law of the Evet Kanani, that is the non-Jewish slave, which remains in the property of the Jew forever. That's literally what it says. Forever. Forever you keep them in your service. So again, the same dispute. When the Torah says that you have to keep them as a slave forever, is it a reshus? It's voluntary. Give it Rabbi Shmuel. This is Rabbi Shmuel's view. You don't have to keep the slave forever, but if you want to, you may. But Rabbi Akiva says, chayva, it's obligatory. So the third dispute, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva arguing on the same point, is the Torah's instruction here a voluntary one or an obligatory one? Sotah, Kohen going to a funeral of his family members, and number three, holding on to this non-Jewish slave. Do I have to keep it forever or not? Right? This is the Rashi right here. Also, l'shachar avda. Yeah, Akiva would say it's forbidden to free his slave. Okay, so now that this is the end of the Mishnaic text, which informs of these three laws in which Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva maintain the same dispute, whether or not there's obligatory or it is voluntary. Now the Gemara comments. Rav Papa said to Abaye, the Amrila, others have it that it wasn't Rav Papa communicating with Abaye, but it was Rav Misharshia L'Rava. Okay, so two versions to who had this conversation. But the conversation goes as follows. Lema, let us suggest that Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, this dispute between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva as to whether these three items are obligatory or voluntary is not just exclusive to these three laws. This dispute is across the board in all of Torah. Demar Amar Shus, Rabbi Shmuel says it's voluntary. Umar Amar Rabbi Akiva says it's obligatory. Right. So in other words, like this, it's not uncommon where the Mishnah is not going to list every single scenario in which a dispute is occurring. The Mishnah will sometimes just tell us one or two or three cases in which there's a dispute, and the Mishnah is expecting the reader to figure out that this dispute is universal. And oftentimes the Gemara will ask, well, why do you select these three as an example and not other ones if it's universal? And the Gemara will explain why these three are important to tell us, because you might have thought that they're exceptions to the rule or for some other reason. But it's not uncommon that the Mishnah will select one or two examples of a universal rule. And therefore, in this conversation between these two Gemara age sages, sometime post Mishnah, they're suggesting, maybe this dispute between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva is not limited to these three cases, but actually universal, which would mean then that Rabbi Shmuel's view, which says it's voluntary, means no obligation to put on tefillin. If this were true, because the Torah says put on tefillin, it's voluntary. Rabbi Akiva says obligatory, right? If we were to take this dispute and make it universal, that would mean any positive commandment Torah says thou shalt do something is voluntary. If you want, you may. Right? There's a lot of mitzvahs we do that would become not obligatory but voluntary in Rabbi Shmuel's view. So it's quite a broad way of thinking of this dispute. But Amar Le, but the response came either Abaye to Rav Papa or Rava to Rav Misharshia. Hacha, in these three instances, bekroi pligi. They're arguing specifically in these three cases because of the phrasing of the verse. Don't take this as a universal dispute. That because this dispute, as whether it's obligatory or voluntary, in the case of the Sotah, or the case of the Kohen going to the funeral, or in the case of keeping the non-Jewish slave, don't make that a universal rule. These three cases specifically have specific verses that are written in such a way that invite this kind of dispute. But it's not a universal rule, which means with the exception of these three, everybody agrees, including Rabbi Shmuel, that it's obligatory. And thus, don't think that tefillin is somehow became voluntary all of a sudden. It's still obligatory, even Rabbi Shmuel's view. It was just a suggested reading, and the Gemara now rejects that. Okay, so I think we're going to stop over here because the Gemara is going to introduce us into a whole other discussion, which essentially is going to be, the Gemara is going to go through each of these three examples, the Sotah, the Kohen becoming impure for his family's funeral, and the slave owner keeping his slave forever. The Gemara is going to analyze the verses surrounding those three laws, and the Gemara is going to explain why Rabbi Shmuel concludes based on the verses that it is voluntary, whereas Rabbi Akiva concludes based on the verses that it's obligatory. But everywhere else in Torah, they both will agree that it remains obligatory to abide by all of Torah's instructions.
Rav Levi, I thought of something while you were speaking. It's very interesting, that beautiful example of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of the Rebbe, who just to show someone that they have to examine, even in the most minute ways, their own ways in trying to tell someone what to do and so on, that he did the following. A mother came with her child. You probably heard this story. Mother came with her child to him, who had a very severe case of diabetes. Did you hear about this?
No.
No, a very severe case of diabetes. And the child kept going into a coma. And he was actually old enough to understand. He was probably in his teens. So as a result, the rabbi said, come back next week with him. The mother said, but I'm here already. Why can't you speak to him now? She said, I'm sorry, I can't speak to him now. I'll speak to him next week. And that was the time when you could still see the Rebbe a little bit easier. And so the mother came with the son a week later. And the Rebbe said to the child, he spoke to him alone. He had the mother outside the room. And he told the child that from now on, you really have to ensure that you take care of yourself. So many people love you. You have so much to do in your life. There's so much joy that you can derive. And he explained to him that he shouldn't eat sweet things. The child agreed. And the mother then came into the room. She said, I heard what you said to my child. I'm so grateful. But Rabbi, could you tell me, why is it that you didn't tell him last week? He said, because I had to stop eating sugar for a week. So the whole idea of how we, even the most minute things, are we examining in ourselves?
Yeah.
Before we tell someone else what to do.
There's a similar story. That's a very good story. There's a similar story of I think it was the second Chabad Rebbe, may have been the third. And somebody came to him during audiences, someone came in and asked for a rectification for some sin that he had done. And I think it was the third Chabad Rebbe. And he told him, I'm sorry, I can't give you a rectification. You gotta leave my office. Man left, and for the week, the Rebbe wouldn't see anybody. He was not greeting anybody. And Chassidim started to get worried, like, what's going on here? After a week or so, the Rebbe calls him back and gives him a rectification. And when the Chassidim approached to ask what happened, so he explained that whenever I give a rectification for someone who has sinned, I look within myself and try to find where, in some subtle way, I have that sin. And then I see how I can rectify it in my own experience in this very subtle way. And then I give the rectification for the other person. That this person came to me with such a wild sin, I could not find anywhere within me that I would have such a thing, even on the most subtle level. So I spent the week, going inward, examining my own life and trying to find some subtle way in which I share that sin, rectify it, and then I called him back to give him a rectification. I can't remember the details of the story. My father does, and he'll tell you exactly what the sin was and what how the Rebbe found it in himself. Like the details of the story are known, but this is the general gist of the story, making the same point. Magnificent. To talk to somebody else, it doesn't mean that you just do it without first doing some self-examination.
It's magnificent. You should be gebenched, Rabbi. Wish you a beautiful day, blessed day. You should go from strength to strength.
Thank you.
Amen.
All the way back.